Welcome to session 8 of block 1 of the Blue Shield training programme for national committees. And session 8 is talking about the Blue Shield approach. If you remember at the end of the last session that I did, I talked about the Resolution 2 of the 1954 Hague Convention Conference, and that national committees were supposed to be set up, and they would have their chief functions as to advise the government concerning the measures required for the implementation of the convention, to approach its government with a view to ensuring that cultural property situated within its own territory or within that of other countries is known to and respected and protected by the armed forces of the country. And finally, to arrange for liaison and cooperation with other similar national committees and with any competent international authority. So that's what the drafters of the 54 Hague Convention thought that a national committee of some to be defined organisation might have as its remit. We've gone a little bit further than that. I think all of those issues are covered in the second bullet point there, to promote the ratification of and respect for and implementation of the 1954 Hague Convention and its 2 protocols. But we package that within some broader ideas about what national committees and the Blue Shield in general is supposed to do. So more broadly, to protect cultural and natural heritage, tangible and intangible, from the effects of conflict and environmental disaster, to raise awareness of the importance of protecting heritage in emergency situations, to promote and provide relevant training to heritage professionals, the armed forces, other emergency responders, and those involved in preventing the illicit trafficking of looted objects, to promote community engagement with and participation in protecting cultural property, and encourage cooperation with and between other relevant entities encouraged in emergency situations. And some of the wording there is perhaps wording we might not now use, but though that's a direct quote from paragraph 2 of our current Articles of Association. So the approach, as we call it, has been developed since 2012, building on some of those earlier aspirations and going back to that Hague Conference in 1954. It builds on developing current practice and setting short and medium and long-term goals for the future. It reflects an evolving journey and is constantly becoming more focused and clearer. It essentially deals with why we do things and how we do things. It's not in any way intended to be a straitjacket to restrict the actions of national committees, but rather to provide national flexibility within a common context. I think we are close to an end product, an end version of the approach, but I think I might have said that in 2014 and most years since. But I think we are much closer than we have been. The critical thing is that our work must start in peacetime, immediately before or even worse during conflict or a disaster is simply too late and CPP will not get done. So if you remember from earlier presentations, we envisage all of this with this diagram, with the cultural and heritage sector here up at the top, humanitarian sector, uniform sector, as the 3 points of the Blue Shield triangle. And these are the 3 sectors who are able to really work on cultural property protection in the broader context of politics, law, the media, and all of that working for the development of healthy, stable, peaceful, secure, and sustainable communities. So the approach really includes and pulls together a number of different elements of what we've already been talking about, and some of which we'll talk about in detail more in block 2, and some of which I'll mention a little bit more in detail in the next half hour or so. So the approach includes the 5 issues we talked about, the Strasbourg Charter, which we've mentioned, our mission statement, which we've mentioned, the 4-tier approach, which has been mentioned briefly, our 6 areas of activity, the 8 threats to cultural property in conflict, and the 7 reasons why cultural property protection is important for the uniformed and humanitarian sectors. So I'm going to go through some of all these issues now in that order. So just to remind you, the 5 issues, firstly, do we prioritize people or things? And we prioritize both, but people first always. However, as you may remember, we always say that protecting people is indivisibly intertwined with protecting their cultural property. Second issue, do we talk about property or do we talk about heritage? We normally talk about cultural property and cultural property protection in line with the legal definition in the 1954 Hague Convention. But actually, as long as everybody who is listening knows what you're talking about, it really doesn't matter whether you talk about cultural property or cultural heritage. Issue 3, the aspiration that we as Blue Shield, or originally the Blue and White Shield, might eventually become the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross movement. Absolutely, that's our long-term goal. And that aspiration dates back to those who drafted the convention and as put into text by the International Committee of the Red Cross back in 1955. Issue 4, why is cultural property protection important? And you'll remember, excuse me, we focused on a number of things there, that it provides a sense of place, sense of identity and belonging, contributing to individual and community well-being and dignity, helping to build healthy, peaceful, secure, sustainable communities. And that last bit, healthy, peaceful, secure, sustainable communities, is really what I perceive those 3 different sectors, cultural and heritage, humanitarian and uniformed, all coming to, aspiring to deliver, but starting in different places. And then issue 5, a health warning. Cultural property can be used as an excuse for and target in conflict, and it has been, as well as a vehicle for understanding mutual recognition and peace building. So we have to realize that we are dealing with a double-edged sword. The second element of this presentation, the Strasbourg Charter, just to really flag that, the Blue Shield, increasingly a term we use is the Blue Shield movement, is an international organization, BSI, with national committees, and we strive to work with joint action, independence, neutrality, professionalism, respect for cultural identity, and to be not for profit. One of the things that we have to acknowledge and work around is that national committees may not always be able to manage to be fully neutral. And that's because, of course, national committees have to work with national organizations, including national armed forces. So while the aspiration is there and the independence of a national committee should always be there, there may be a difficulty for you in some instances in maintaining firm and complete neutrality. And that's just something we need to be aware of, to strive for, but acknowledge it may not always be manageable. The Blue Shield mission is the third element of this presentation. And just to reiterate it and to go through it once more, The Blue Shield is committed to the protection of the world's cultural property and is concerned with the protection of cultural and natural heritage, tangible and intangible, in the event of armed conflict, natural or human-made disaster. So going back to that list of activities that a national committee might do as envisaged in 1954, we've broadened it and we look at that whole range. In session 2, I talked quite a lot about the 4-tier approach, that effective cultural property protection means working with partners and requires action at the long term, which is essentially education, immediately before conflict, immediately before deployment, not during, as the slide says, training, in emergency, in conflict, support, and post-emergency conflict, again, support. Those are the 4 areas we need to be active. And just to refresh your minds about that, you can go back if you want to see how I broke that down a little bit more in session 2. But for CPP to be effective, it needs to become part of our partners' constant, common and basic thinking. They can't get up in the morning without thinking about how do they deal with cultural property in the rest of their day's work. That's the aspiration. We also have our 6 areas of activity. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. Coordination, legal compliance, implementation and policy development. Number 3, proactive protection and risk preparedness. 4, education, training and capacity building. 5, emergency response. 6, post-disaster recovery and long-term support. Coordination is done at an international level with partners by BSI, at a national level with the national community committees. The legal compliance, again, is done at an international and a national level. Probably the biggest focus of all of our work is education, training and capacity building. And we are still developing and taking our first steps in terms of emergency response and long-term post-disaster recovery and support. In terms of emergency response, the disaster in Beirut has focused our mind more on that emergency response and how we can help in those areas. And we've got a paper coming to the BSI board in December, looking at the setting up of emergency response unit or capability somehow within broader Blue Shield, and we'll obviously let you know about how that develops. So those 6 areas of activity, I'm not going to go through in any more detail. You all know them, you all plan and report on them now. Thank you very much. And that's critical for us to have that common context. And again, as I stress or stressed in the earlier presentations, that common context is critical to attracting significant funding in the future. So thank you for doing all of that already. We then get to the 8 threats to cultural property and conflict, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on these just to pull them apart a little bit and to identify what we mean by them all. So they're all there on the screen: lack of planning, lack of military and humanitarian awareness, collateral and accidental damage, specific or deliberate targeting, looting, pillage and spoils of war, deliberate reuse of sites, enforced neglect and development. And while these are all, or were originally developed in relation to armed conflict, we see from doing various training programs that they are all equally, in slightly different ways, but applicable for peacekeeping and following disasters. So what I'm going to do is just go through them now in a little bit more detail, picking out some of the ideas. So firstly, lack of planning. If cultural property protection isn't included at the planning stage of uniformed or humanitarian deployments, there will be no cultural property protection put into practice during the deployment. If a soldier doesn't have an order to do something, that something will not get done. And the orders for the whole military formation, right down to the most junior private, are developed and put into place during the planning stage. If it's not in planning, it won't happen. So we have got to get CPP into planning. And that's where we spend a lot of our time at Blue Shield International, working with armed forces. And here there's an image of Emma working with a NATO exercise, making sure that they understand the importance of including CPP in planning, so that when there is a CPP problem during the exercise or in reality, they know how to do it and they are ready because they've planned. And hopefully they've planned to the extent that they have mitigated the threat to make it not become a real risk. The second area is lack of military or humanitarian awareness. And if the uniformed or humanitarian sectors are not convinced of the importance of CPP, it will not be incorporated into education, training, or operational planning. So here in this image, it takes us back to 2013, where for the first time, UNESCO and Blue Shield ran a training course for the Lebanese armed forces and the UN peacekeeping deployment in Lebanon. And this was really the first time that we had pushed the importance of CPP to those combined organizations. And as a result of that, 7 years later, when the explosion happened at Beirut port on the 4th of August 2020, it was UNIFIL who came to Blue Shield saying, how can we help with cultural property protection and stabilization after the explosion? And we worked closely with both the Lebanese Armed Forces and UNIFIL to do that stabilization and securing work following the explosion. That would never have happened had we not worked with both organizations since 2013. It's the development of partnership, it's the development of that mutual trust and respect that prompted that phone call from UNIFIL to see how they could help in 2020. There will always be collateral and accidental damage to cultural property during conflict. Armed conflict and disasters cause significant damage, and most of it, or much of it, is unintended or accidental. And there is no way that you will say that cultural property will not be damaged during that. It will be. Here you just have an example of damage in an area in the Second World War. But by raising awareness of the 8 threats in education and training programs, the likelihood of the threats becoming real risks should be lowered significantly. So did all that damage have to take place behind and around those tanks? Possibly, but possibly not. And we need to make sure that that is absolutely a last resort to damage property. And that goes back to, of course, international law, and goes back to the thinking of Sun Shao 2,500 years ago. Some sites will be targeted and deliberately or specifically targeted for damage. Recent conflicts have seen this in bucket loads, spades by armed non-state actors as a weapon of war. So think of ISIS, think of their attacks on the Yazidi, Think of Ansardine in Timbuktu. On occasion, armed forces have had to, even if they've incorporated cultural property protection into their planning, may also have to target cultural property through military necessity. But this should only happen as a last resort where there is no other military option. So if you go back to my analogy of earlier of a town where there is a river and there are two bridges across the river, one a historic bridge which has been there for 500 or 600 years, the other a modern bridge. If both bridges are available, then the attacking army are obliged to use the modern bridge. If, however, that has been badly damaged, or if by going across it, you would expose troops to massively higher levels of risk than by going across the historic bridge, that might be seen as a reason for using the historic bridge, assuming it is still there. That's sort of military necessity, but it is a last resort, and the last resort mindset needs to become normal military practice. And interestingly, the image here is the sign of, is an image of the first deliberate attack on the UK mainland in the First World War, targeting civilians and not targeting any military objective. So the bombardment of the coastal town on the northeast coast of England of Hartlepool, purely there to undermine the confidence of the civilian population. So that sort of deliberate targeting is against international humanitarian law and should not happen. But military necessity may, as a very last resort, dictate it to happen. Looting, pillage and spoils of war is the next issue. Armed conflict and disasters frequently create what we refer to as a vacuum of authority, in which non-combatants may loot movable cultural property, and military or deployed civilian personnel, including humanitarians, may pillage, i.e. steal, objects as personal souvenirs or remove items, so-called spoils of war, for example, as communal mementos for regimental museums or dining areas. And the image there from the Second World War with the sign saying, "The war may end soon, don't be a fool and get 2 years for looting." Okay, so looting is a real problem post-conflict with this vacuum of authority. Sometimes it's the only solution for a civilian population who have lost everything else. And it's very difficult to blame a community if the only source of income to feed their families is through stealing historic objects. But we need to put in place issues where you don't have to push the civilian population into that situation. So again, looting, pillage and spoils of war are known as problems before war. They need to be put into planning so that they don't become a reality towards the end of the conflict. There is an issue about the deliberate reuse of sites, and cultural sites are frequently used as shelters by internally displaced people and breaking international law by belligerents. And not infrequently, such use causes damage to the sites. So the image here is of Pevensey Castle, a early castle in the south of England, originally dating to the 11th century. Most of the walls that you can see probably dating to about the 13th century. But here the site being deliberately reused by the military, because here is not part of the original castle or even the 13th century castle, but this is a Second World War pillbox machine gun post. And there were a number of these machine gun posts put into the fabric of Pevensey Castle. Obviously, this was done in the early 1940s, probably 1940, and therefore before the Hague Convention of 54, although it was questionable whether this was legal even in 1940. But this shouldn't happen in the future. Enforced neglect is when people like us, mainly cultural property experts, can't get to those sites and places we are responsible for. So much cultural property requires constant expert monitoring. And during armed conflict, such access frequently becomes problematic and or impossible. As a result, roof tiles slip on historic buildings that let in rain, or essential environmental conditions in an archive or in a museum can fail due to electricity interruption, both of which can, of course, cause significant damage to and loss of cultural property. And the image here shows a photograph taken by Emma of the falling off of protective materials on the external side of a Syrian site at Tel Baidar. And it's that sort of stuff that would have easily been looked after had normal heritage practice been able to carry on. But because it wasn't, a small problem becomes a big problem. And finally, development. Development is a constant threat to cultural property during peacetime, but the vacuum of authority exacerbates the problem as individuals knock down or encroach on cultural property sites for their own personal gain. And the image that we've got here is not actually damage to cultural property yet, but what happened here in Beirut is that following the civil war, developers bought up a lot of old buildings and on purpose let them decay, so that they eventually became a threat to people passing by and a danger to those people. And as a result, they became, rather than protected under Lebanese law as a historic building, they were allowed to be demolished because they were a potential risk to those in the vicinity. As a result, the developers who simplistically bought this for $100 may be able to sell it for $100,000 and scale that up in terms of real costs. So development and the aspiration of development can lead to significant damage of historic buildings and the historic environment. All of this brings us to the sort of almost a final element of this, the 7 reasons why cultural property protection is important for the uniformed and the humanitarian sectors. And this is part of what Blue Shield brings to that conversation in the triangle. So firstly, the international community, for example, the UN Security Council, sees attacks on cultural property as a security issue, making it incumbent on the uniformed and humanitarian organizations to give it serious attention. Secondly, the protection of people, enshrined as a military and humanitarian responsibility in wider international humanitarian and international human rights law, is indivisibly intertwined with the protection of their cultural property. That's a key message that we have constantly got to keep banging on about. We're not just protecting old things that are of interest to heritage people. we're protecting the development and the re-establishment of healthy, safe, secure, sustainable communities. Thirdly, any deployment must be fully aware of its legal responsibilities with regard to CPP under international and national law. And that's critical if you don't want to come up against legal issues. Section 4, military commanders and senior humanitarian staff need to be aware of how cultural property may be used before or during a conflict as an integral part of the political strategy or tactics. In other words, that's the bad half of the same coin that I talked about before, the warning note that cultural property may be used as a tool in the fighting, and everybody needs to be aware of that and to try to mitigate the opportunity for that. Fifth, looting of cultural property, which we've already seen, can provide funding to enable the continuation of a conflict or the continuation of instability following a disaster. So it is incumbent on the uniformed and humanitarian sectors to try to mitigate the impact or even the starting of looting. 6, there is a uniformed and humanitarian imperative to help communities and countries re-establish their economic viability following armed conflict or disaster. Cultural property may have a significant part to play in this through tourism and related job development. So it's a key element of the economic stability of countries post-conflict, post-disaster. And finally, one that doesn't sit overly comfortably with our work, but that we have to be aware of, is that cultural property protection can be deployed as soft power for both the uniformed and humanitarian sectors. It's there that if they are seen to be protecting, then it makes their job easier. And that's fine if it's taken at that basic level. So addressing all of these 7 issues for the uniformed and humanitarian sector helps them and Blue Shield and the heritage sector to again build what I perceive of as the common aspiration: healthy, peaceful, secure, sustainable communities. So that's what we're really about. Now, how do national committees fit in with all of this? So the above and all of this training course is intended to provide the common framework for national committees to work as part of a growing Blue Shield movement. It's not, I re-emphasize, intended as a straitjacket, but as a flexible approach to building a common community through a growing network of national communities. In the Blue Shield approach documents on the BSI website, which I would encourage you to go and look at, we identify a number of people who may well be good ideas to bring onto a national committee, either as a full member or in some instances with observer status to that national committee. So obviously anybody who is a member of one of the founding 4 organisations, ICOM, MICA, ICOMOS or IFLA, other heritage professionals and heritage institutions, civil defence professionals and services involved in the protection of CP, military personnel and services concerned with the protection of cultural property. Now, it may be that those people do not want to be full members of the committee, but they may be very willing, as for example, the Ministry of Defence is in the UK, in terms of the UK National Committee, to have formal observer status, which enables them to talk and discuss the committee, but excludes them from any formal decision-making of that committee. Students, we need to involve students in all of this work because they are the future. They are the people who are going to inherit the building blocks that we're putting down at the moment, and really be able to develop and deliver the Blue Shield as the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross movement. Other people more likely perhaps to want to be observers rather than members are regional and local authorities and other public institutions dedicated to the conservation and protection of cultural property, NGOs concerned with the protection of cultural property, and any individual having an active role in the framework of the missions of the Blue Shield and respecting its fundamental principles. So again, with UK National Commission close to my mind, as I used to chair it, we had one or two people who were involved in the media who and journalists who wanted to help through their work protect cultural property. And here a longer list of other potential observers and partners who may want to be part of the discussion, but not necessarily part of the decision-making process. So national governments, non-governmental organisations, national civil society organisations, national heritage organisations, national media organisations, national disaster risk reduction teams, national humanitarian sector, other relevant national authorities and emergency services, blue light services, local communities and volunteer groups, national universities and other research centres, relevant private institutions, and again, the national uniform sector. So those are all the sorts of people who, if you're not actually having them on the committee, you need to think very clearly about working closely with to deliver the specific national response to this broader context provided by the Blue Shield approach. So final thoughts, we're at the beginning of a long process. We're 25 years old. The International Red Cross movement is over 100+ years old. But in the last few years, we have nearly doubled the number of active national committees. We have now 30, and there are 10 more at the moment in various stages of development. We cannot and we do not expect every national committee to be able to deliver all of the above immediately or even in the medium term. All national committees come with their specific contexts and their specific constraints, but they all also come with their own specific opportunities. And what we need to do is build on those opportunities while acknowledging the context and the constraints, and working together we can, and I think we will, build an effective and efficient Blue Shield movement that really is the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross. And that's where we're working towards, and that's what this training program is all about. And thank you very much once again for listening.